There are things in the Bible that are mysterious. There are things that are hard to get your head around sometimes, and it's real easy to read this verse and grasp it and think you know what it means and ditch that verse because it doesn't agree with what you just read over here. And so you seem to build these contradictions in scriptures in your mind, and you take one or the other. But what I hope to do in this is to try and bring us to a way of understanding some of these type of issues, and how God is great in His planning and His design, and how everything was built in order to give us life and have it abundantly with Jesus Christ for all eternity. And so what I want to do is talk about covenants, because I think that one of the keys of understanding all this is understanding what a covenant really is. And covenant is one of these words that doesn't get thrown around in modern day society very much at all. In fact, we just kind of think, well, isn't that just a promise? Or isn't that just an oath or whatever? And we've kind of shortened it a little bit. And I think that we've misunderstood what the Bible presents as a covenant because it's not part of our modern day culture, but it's very important. So the text of our sermon is going to basically come from Deuteronomy. First off, what's happening here is they're getting ready to enter into the promised land. This is the end of the Moses story. Deuteronomy 29, this is the back end of it. This is right before Moses dies, and they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And there's some sermons that Moses starts throwing out, and they begin here, or they've been going on through Deuteronomy. But here in chapter 29, I want to look at what he says. He says, Moses summoned all the Israelites and said to them, "You have seen with your own eyes everything the Lord did in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to his whole country. All the great tests of strength, the miraculous signs, and the amazing wonders. But to this day the Lord has not given you minds that you understand, nor eyes that see, nor ears that hear." Okay, so Moses is saying, like, you've been with me through all this rough time, and you've seen God take you from point A to point B and give you all these blessings, but I still think you're missing it. I don't think you're quite getting the fact that there's a covenant involved, and that's what he's going to get to here in a minute. That there is a promise, there is something that's happening here that's greater than you, and it's greater than your faith, it's greater than your ability to follow God, and that is God has a role in your life and what is about to happen, and He has not given you minds to understand it yet. Now, I read this, I think about quite a big chunk of my Christian walk because I could say the exact same thing. There was parts of it I didn't get. I just didn't understand it. I took one side of an argument and stood on that, and everyone else was wrong. And I didn't have a full understanding. I didn't have those eyes that see or the ears that hear. And so I think that what he's about to do is now expound upon them what it is that they should have been seeing all this time. So we drop down to verse 9. He says, "Therefore, keep the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. You are standing today, all of you, before the Lord your God, the heads of your tribes, your elders and your officers, all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and the sojourner who is in your camp, from the one who chops your wood to the one who draws your water, so that you may enter into the sworn covenant of the Lord your God, which the Lord your God is making with you today, that He may establish you today as His people, and that He may be your God, as He promised you, and as He swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Continuing on, "It is not with you alone that I am making this sworn covenant, but with whoever is standing here with us today before the Lord our God, and with whoever is not here with us today." This is implying future tense So there's this covenant that he's about to talk about extends way beyond the Israelites. Comes all the way into this room today, the covenant that he's referring to. He says, you know how we lived in the land of Egypt and how we came through the midst of the nations through which you passed, and you have seen their detestable things, their idols of wood and stone, of silver and gold, which were among them. Beware, lest there be any among you, a man or a woman or a clan or a tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations. Beware, lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit, one who, when he hears the word of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be safe. Though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart, this will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. Now, this is kind of wordy, but there are some things in this passage that I want us to look at. He's talking about covenant, and he's telling them you've been under a covenant, and I'm going to tell you that you're about to reap a reward from the covenant. However, beware. There's a problem if you serve other gods. If you go against God, then there's going to be penalties. So, first let's look at some of the things that he uses in this term. Notice one of the parts of that passage says that he may establish you today as his people and that he may be your God as he promised. Personal pronouns, possessive personal pronouns are everywhere in this passage. Your God. You will be his people and he will be your God. There's all this possessive stuff going on. Now what happens like today whenever we're talking and I say, my Kevin, or my Mandy, you know that there's a relationship there. It's not just Kevin and Mandy. These are people who I have a possessive draw to because of the relationship that we are in. And we are in some sort of a strange covenantal type of relationship because we're father, son, father, daughter. And we'll get to some of that in a minute. So this is an important part of covenant, is that there is a possessive nature to it. Secondly, he says, so that you may enter by oath into the covenant. So here's another part of a covenant that is interesting. Oaths. That implies legal. There's a legal side to this relationship. And that legal side is that there are penalties and there are rewards, and we'll see a little bit about this here in a minute. But so that you have a blend. Possessive, that's love, right? Like he's my Kevin and she's my Mandy because there's a fatherly love there, right? So there's love in this. But at the same time, it's a legal type of thing. So there are legalities involved. So it's this perfect blend of law and love that's inside of a covenant. So what's the difference between that and what we normally have today? Well, there's different types of relationships. There are consumer relationships, and then there are covenant relationships. Now, most modern relationships are consumer relationships. And that's just, to be honest with you, that's where we've ended up. What does that mean? That means in the relationship, you're a consumer. Now, where that's designed to work well is, for example, my barber or my mechanic. We have a consumer relationship. You know, I'll pay you what I owe you as long as you provide me the service you've promised to provide me to my satisfaction. And if I don't like what you do, and if I don't like the quality of service that I'm getting, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to get this car mechanic. Okay, so that's a consumer relationship. And unfortunately, a lot of things that were intended to be covenantal relationships, like even marriage. Marriage is a covenantal relationship. But we've made it a consumer relationship because once again we do the same thing, right? As I will do those vows I said on my wedding day as long as you do the vows that you said on your wedding day. We make it conditional based on performance, and it turns it into a consumer relationship. I will be what I promised I would be as long as I get my needs fulfilled. And that makes it a consumer relationship. So the difference between that and a covenant relationship is a covenant relationship says, I will be what I should be, what I've promised myself to be, whether you are or not. So that's the difference between a consumer relationship and a covenantal relationship. And the most beautiful thing in the world is when you have two people or three people or whatever in a covenantal relationship and everyone keeps their side of that bargain. Right? I will do what I promised I will do regardless. And if you do that, if everybody's doing that, what happens? Is a beautiful thing. Like it all functions perfectly because we're not focusing on ourselves. So we see that God is talking about this covenant here. So you see this also in our Christian walk. People turn Christianity into a consumer relationship. So you come to church and you church shop, right? Let's see if they can provide for me and fill my needs and get what I need out of this. If they don't, well then I'll go over here to the next church. Instead of looking at it like a covenantal thing where I have something that I'm bringing to the table and I'm going to do that whether or not my needs are met or not. So how often do we do that, right? I mean, that is what we do. How many times have you heard, well, I didn't stay in that church because I just wasn't being fed? Well, you know what? Babies need to be fed. Grown-ups go make sandwiches. And they make one another sandwiches. And so if we're in this together, and if we're serving one another, we're feeding one another, it's not a consumer relationship that we have. It is a covenantal relationship that we have. And that's part of the beauty of this. But it all began way back here and in this time. So the mystery of this covenant comes up in some of these passages that we just read through. So, for example, covenants have conditions and rewards and penalties tied to whether or not you're doing what you promised you would do. Verse 9 of what we just read said, you will come into the land and you will reap the reward for a reward of what God promised you. But verse 18 says, if you follow other gods, then you're going to die, basically. That was how it was phrased. The paradox is, where does God stand on all this? Right? Because we're all broken people and we're all going to fail. And we're all going to disobey. So the paradox of the Bible and of Scripture has always been God's nature, where He says, I cannot bless a disobedient people. I am a just judge and cannot overlook guilt. There are literally hundreds of passages in the Bible that speak like this. That say basically, I can't bless you if you disobey me. Constantly. However, there are equally the same number of passages that say, I will never leave you or forsake you. I will finish the work that I began in you. I will bless you no matter what. So on one hand, it sounds conditional. You do this and you get that. But on the other hand, it sounds completely unconditional. I'm going to bless you even when you fail. So this has been a mystery of the Bible for years and years and years. And people have usually fallen on either one side or the other. It's kind of an irresolvable tension. And it's the plot line of the whole Bible. When people fail, does God accept them anyway? If so, what about His holiness? When people fail, does He forsake them? Well, what about His faithfulness? Is this a conditional or an unconditional oath? Is this or a covenant? And the Bible almost seems contradictory in many places, and what happens is it leads people to either be legalists or they go absolutely crazy and say, it doesn't matter what I do because I'm going to fall anyway. I might as well just be whatever and not even care about it. But the cool thing is that this seeming contradiction is never openly addressed in the Old Testament at all. This is why, like the passage that Dylan brought up this morning, where he says, my job is to preach the mystery of the gospel. The mystery is the fact that it was unresolved in the Old Covenant. We have examples of God blessing people even when they disobeyed. And we have examples of God striking people down when they disobeyed. It was never fully resolved, and we never really got a chance to see it. So this term mystery, what it means is not something like we think of Sherlock Holmes. You know, it's a mystery. You know, he's got to crack the case. You know, that sort of thing. But that's not how the Bible addresses this word mystery. A mystery is something that was hidden before, but now it's been revealed. And now you can see the fullness of it. And this all happens as a result. If we are to understand the covenant, it was explained in the Old Testament, it was just hidden. So I've often said the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. So there's a connection in that. And if we'll understand this mystery, it goes a long way in helping us to understand our Christian walk. Notice what he said there in verse 13 of what we read. He said, "Today he will affirm that you are his people and that he is your God, just as he promised you and as he swore by oath to your ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So he makes reference here to a promise. He makes reference to an oath that was made to specifically Abraham. And we find that reading in Genesis, the 15th chapter, verse 18, or verse 8. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here's how it goes. God is telling Abraham, I'm going to bless you and all your descendants, the whole world is going to be blessed by your seed. Like, I am going to give you this great blessing, and the whole world is going to benefit from it. He also tells him, all these things, I'm going to make a nation of you, and your descendants will be like the grains of sand on the shore, and as the stars in the sky. It's going to be that numerous. And he also made other promises to him. This land that we're in right now, they were in Canaan at the time. This land is going to be your ancestors' land many years to come. So when all this is being said, what does Abraham do? How can I be sure, God? I mean, yeah, that's great for you to say all this. But my wife is barren, and I'm an old man, and I just don't see how this could happen. Abraham said, Lord God, how can I be sure that I will own this land? And the Lord said to Abraham, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old goat, and a 3-year-old male sheep, a dove, and a young pigeon. Now wait a minute. If you ask God a question like this, and his response was, go get me some farm animals. Today, this doesn't make any sense to us, right? God doesn't even tell him what to do with those animals. But you know what? Abraham knows what to do with them. Listen to what he says. Abraham brought them all to God. And then Abraham killed those animals and cut each of them into 2 pieces, laying each half opposite the other half. But he did not cut the birds in half. Later, large birds or carrion came down and flew down to eat the animals, but Abraham chased them away. So Abraham somehow knew what God was after when God said, go get these farm animals. Abraham knew, okay, I'm going to get them, I'm going to cut them up, and I'm going to build an aisle out of them. So what is that all about? Well, we have to do a little research to find out what in the world was going on. In their culture, this is called the covenantal sacrifice. And the way it functions is this. Let's say you're a master of some land and you have servants. You want to hire a servant for life. You get into a covenantal relationship with that servant. And so what you do is you do exactly what Abraham did. You cut these animals in half and you build an aisle. And the master, the Lord, says, okay, here are the conditions of our covenant. Now you have to agree to these conditions, read them, and walk through this aisle of blood that has been created by these dead animals. And so the servant would take it and he would walk through and recite the conditions of the covenant. Now the conditions would spell out the reward for good service and the penalty for bad service. And the penalty for bad service meant I will be as these animals if I break my vow. That's the point in cutting the animals apart and their blood being everywhere, so that the servant could see the entrails and the grotesqueness and the devastation that he would have to endure if he broke the vows of that covenant. So God's already set forth the conditions of the covenant here. He told Abraham all this stuff he was going to promise to give him. And Abraham's getting ready to do this. And if we continue reading, we find out that Abraham's waiting on God. And I'm sure he's ready to walk through those animals he just cut up and make those vows that God gives him. But you know what? A strange thing happens. A weird thing happens. Abraham falls asleep, and God shows up while he's asleep. And God comes down in the form of a man with a smoking pot, so he's veiled and he can't be seen. In the midst of this darkness, God came down with a smoking pot and a torch, and he himself walked through the middle of that covenant and recited the vows of the covenant. So what exactly does that mean? There's two major shocks here. One is that God himself became in human form in the midst of darkness and walked through the blood, signifying that if the vows of this covenant are broken, may he be made like these animals that were slain. The second shock was this: Abraham was never asked to take part in the covenant. So it's in a way unconditional. So what this basically was signifying, and this is so beautiful to me. Think about the metaphor of what's happening. The animals were slain. Darkness came upon the land. You know, there's another time in history where darkness came upon the land in an inopportune hour. It happened at Calvary. God came down in the form of a man and walked between those sacrifices. Jesus Christ was God in the form of a man. Emmanuel, God with us, came down in the form of a man. And the promise that was made as he's walking through here is that may he be torn apart if the vows are broken. The vows were obviously broken, past, present, and future. And Jesus paid the same way he promised he would. He was torn apart. The covenant was made, and God took both sides of that covenant promise. The master's side and the servant's side. And Abraham was set there benefiting from it without any specific conditions of his own. So this is huge in implication whenever we get to the revelation of this mystery in the New Testament. In Galatians 3, Paul is talking to the Galatians. He says, brothers and sisters, let us think in human terms. Even an agreement made between two persons is firm. After that agreement is accepted by both people, no one can stop it or add anything to it. God made promises both to Abraham and to his descendant. Now God did not say, and unto your descendants. That would mean many people. But God said, and unto your descendant. That means only one person, and that person is Christ. This is what I mean. God had an agreement with Abraham and promised to keep it. The law, which came 430 years later, cannot change that agreement and so destroy God's promise to Abraham. If the law could give us Abraham's blessing, then the promise would not be necessary. But that is not possible because God freely gave His blessings to Abraham through the promise that He made. Okay, so what Paul is saying here, he's saying when God walked among those that sacrifice and covered Himself in that blood, what the promise He was making was that regardless of what laws come after this, there's a promise that God made toward Abraham, and that was that the world would find salvation through your descendant. And Paul is telling the Galatians, quit fighting over obeying laws. That was the circumcision was the main law they were fighting about. And he's like, stop it. That law came much later. This promise was about God fulfilling the promise. He tells the Romans a similar thing in Romans 4. Abraham and his descendants received the promise that they would get the whole world. He did not receive that promise through the law, but through being right with God by his faith. If people could receive what God promised by following the law, then faith is worthless. And God's promise to Abraham is worthless, because the law can only bring God's anger. But if there is no law, there is nothing to disobey. So what is he saying here? He's saying that, you know what? The law can only do one thing, and that's bring God's anger to you. Why is that? Because you're going to fail whatever law is set before you. You're going to mess it up. It doesn't matter. If you tell your child, don't knock over this vase or this glass of water, for some reason the kid just drawn to it and wants to just knock it over. Because that's in our nature. We're drawn to the things that we're told not to do. It says, so people receive God's promise by having faith. This happens so that the promise can be a free gift. Then all of Abraham's children can have that promise. It is not only for those who live under the law of Moses, but for anyone who lives with faith like that of Abraham, who is the father of us all. The ultimate blend of law and love was fulfilled by Jesus Christ. 100% obedient, 100% loving in that He took the penalty in our stead. So I'm going to ask the question again, is the covenant conditional or unconditional? The answer is yes. It is conditional. But Jesus fulfilled the conditions. And it's unconditional because that happened. We have complete assurance. At the cross, Christ fulfilled the conditions of the law so that God can love you unconditionally. With His perfect life, He fulfilled the conditions of the covenant to provide the rewards of the covenant, which is verse 9 of our reading. But with His sacrificial death, He received the penalty of the covenant, which was verse 18. So God played both parts, just like He promised Abraham way back before the law even happened, that He would do when He walked amongst the covenant sacrifice. So what does this do? If you get your head around this, if you can understand that the covenant is conditional and unconditional, and that Christ did both sides of this, what does it do? It produces great service in us. Because otherwise, if you are constantly trying to figure out if you're doing the right thing in order to get to heaven, you're never going to help another person, because you're going to be too busy working on number one. Right? But the whole New Testament teaches us to care about everybody else. What are we talking about in our life groups? Discipleship. It's the key. It's the most important part of what we're called to be. But if you're so hung up on, am I there yet? Have I done enough? If you're constantly in that mode, you will never be able to help somebody else, because you're too busy trying to get out of the mud yourself. But God's already lifted you out of the mud. It produces a paradoxical obedience. Now, what does that mean? It means that our obedience is a way of thanking God and trying to be like God, but is not a way of earning our way to God. So you end up resisting sin like crazy, but never experience a sense of condemnation when you fall into it. Romans 8:1, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So why in the world do we bother obeying when we get our head around the magnitude of what He did for us? How could we not? That should change what we want to do. I have to stop and think, if God died for this, if He is suffering for everything that I do, I need to be concerned about that. And I need to feel sorry about that. And I need to try to be as much like Him as I can possibly be. It also produces absolute trust. How do you know if a covenant relationship partner will keep the covenant. That's the scary part of going into any covenant, right? If you're standing there at the altar about to marry someone and you're saying, I promise that in sickness or in health, in strife, in wealth, in all these things that you promised that you would do, you have to stop and think, how do I know this person sitting across from me is going to keep what they are saying? That's the hard part of going into a covenant relationship. And the thing is, you never know. That's why a covenant relationship is supposed to be unilateral, in that you do what you're supposed to do regardless. But with God, He's given us that assurance because it's already happened. It happened 4,000 years ago when Abraham asked the same question. How do I know you're going to do what you just said you were going to do? And he was like, I'm going to come down and walk through some blood so you know that I will do it. And He did it metaphorically with Abraham, and He did it physically with Jesus Christ. Just like those animals were torn apart, our Savior was torn apart. The nails tore into His hands. The nails tore into His feet. The crowns tore into the flesh of His head. The spear tore into His side. The shards of animal bones striking Him in the scourging whip tore flesh off of His back. He fulfilled His promise that He made to Abraham that day. The third thing that it produces is koinonia. And we've talked about this word 2 or 3 times here in the past few weeks, but it means fellowship. It means church. It means it helps us come together. It helps us get past that consumer relationship, because once we learn that the heart of the covenant, you start to realize that accountability is a good thing. Like, I want people to help me with this. I want partnership in this. I don't want to do it alone, because it's extremely difficult to do alone. Consumers just come to church. But once you understand the covenant, covenant members join. They come together because we've joined with God, and therefore we join with one another. I want to end by thinking about what it meant, I guess, to me whenever I understood this. When I understood what the covenant was, it was like the gospel just, came to life. And all of a sudden, I had this assurance and I had this freedom, but at the same time, I had this intense desire to serve and to be as godly of a man as I could possibly be, knowing I'm going to fail anyway, but my desire changed. And it was all tied around this concept of understanding. And C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Miracles. And he talks about this in there. And he talks about how there's a moment in your life where you are thinking, this God thing, it's a good deal. But then there's that moment when it just snaps with you. And you're like, my gosh, I didn't realize that it was this. That I didn't realize it was so deep. And I didn't realize the love was so great. C.S. Lewis says in this book, he says, it is always shocking to meet life where we thought we were alone. Look out, we cry, it's alive. And therefore, this is the very point at which so many draw back, and I would have done so myself if I could, and proclaim no further or proceed no further with Christianity. An impersonal God? Well, that's well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, and goodness inside of our heads? Well, that's better still. How about a formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap into? Best of all, but God Himself, alive, pulling at the other end of our cord, perhaps approaching us at infinite speed, the hunter, the king, the husband, that is quite another matter. See, there comes a point when the children who have been playing burglars hush suddenly. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, man's search for God, suddenly draw back, supposing we really just found Him. We never meant it to come to that. We're still supposing maybe He found us.